This man has an 8 to 10 year history of killing women all across the country.
An employee coming in just after 8 this morning made the horrible discovery. 4 employees of the Malibu Grand Prix stabbed to death.
She doesn't dispute that she stabbed her husband a staggering 193 times.
Harris's 16-year-old daughter witnessed her stepmother run the wheels of her Mercedes over her dad several times.
Police say the suspect may be responsible for the murders of at least 6 women.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of The Evidence Room. And this week, we're talking about a case that made international news and was the focus of more than one made-for-TV special. In 2004, Susan Wright was convicted of killing her husband, Jeff, by stabbing him 193 times in the couple's Northwest Harris County home. According to detectives, Wright tied her husband to their bed, stabbed him, buried him in the backyard, cleaned up the room, and then went to police to file a domestic violence complaint against a husband she already knew was dead.
She doesn't dispute that she stabbed her husband a staggering 193 times. And she doesn't dispute she buried him behind the carport of their Northwest Harris County home.
Part of the back of the head and the left arm were exposed.
But what drove Susan Wright to do it? Was she a battered woman? A young mother who could no longer sit idly by as her husband, Jeffrey, abused her and their 2 kids? Or was Susan Wright just a cold, calculating killer?
Now, Wright was originally sentenced to 25 years in prison, but that sentence was reduced on appeal. And today, I am joined by KPRC2 legal analyst Brian Weiss, who also represented Wright on an appeal of her original punishment, correct?
Absolutely, Robert.
Okay. So let's start with a little background. How long were Susan and Jeff married?
They had been married several years. It was a marriage that had its problems like some young couples do almost from the start. Jeff was, as the youngsters love to say, a player. Marriage was not going to tie him down. His roving eye was a problem that ultimately resulted in what happened that fateful night that we're still talking about 2 decades later.
The one thing that I think struck me when I'm looking in the archives, we call it the evidence room, but it's the Harris County Trial Exhibit Archive. There were so many pictures of the family. I know no one knows what goes on behind closed doors, but you look at those pictures, that looked like a genuinely happy family.
They looked more than like a genuinely happy family. They looked like a veritable ad for any kind of product that you'd want to sell to middle America. They had the look of a couple with 2 beautiful young kids. And again, you've said it, but I know it was one of the favorite sayings that my mom had. You may think that people have a happy marriage, but you don't know what goes on behind those closed doors, Robert.
27-year-old Susan Wright and her attorneys are hoping the jurors will be understanding of the battered wife syndrome. The defense claims Susan was kicked, punched, and emotionally abused, and that she feared for her life and the lives of the couple's 2 young children on the night she admits stabbing her husband, Jeffrey Wright, nearly 200 times at their home in Northwest Harris County, then partially burying his body in the back patio area.
I'm hopeful we'll have a jury that will be an excellent jury in this case, will be fair and impartial, and will set their emotions aside and decide the case based on the facts.
My understanding, her first attorney, she actually, I don't know if you call it a confession or what, but actually went to him and told him what happened.
From the very beginning, Susan and her family hired attorney Neil Davis, who was working for first ballot Hall of Famer Dick DeGuerin. Neil had been licensed only a couple of years, and to be confronted at that stage of his career with a prospective client who walks in and says, I've killed my husband, I've buried him in the backyard, what are we going to do? And at that point, Neil literally went to the district attorney's office intake division, and for our viewers, that's the division of the DA's office, where generally police officers go to file charges in all kinds of cases. In this case, Neil Davis went and spoke to a veteran prosecutor who was working intake and said, there's something that I've got to tell you. You'll find a body buried in West Houston at this location.
A love nest that turned into a torture chamber is how prosecutors describe Susan Wright's alleged plan to kill her husband to start a new life. The state claims a brand new insurance policy of $200,000 and that she recently enrolled in college classes is what motivated her. They claim on the night of January 13th, 2003, Susan Wright put the couple's 2 young children to bed, then lured Jeffrey into the bedroom and tied his wrists to the bedposts with neckties that belonged to him and bound his ankles as well, then stabbed him over his entire body.
New attorney or old attorney, that's still pretty unsettling to have a client walk in and go, okay, here's what I've done.
Let me say this, in 45 years of doing this, and again, admittedly, mostly appellate and post-conviction work, not in the trenches in the trial court, I couldn't imagine what that would be like. So I think it's really difficult to wrap our collective heads around how a young lawyer like Neil Davis felt.
So one of the things also too that's in the Harris County archives is there's the crime scene video that was taken by detectives as well as the crime scene photographs. And it looks like she went to pretty great lengths to try and clean up that room. It looks like she tried to paint it, there was bleach, there was a lot done in that room to try and cover this up, but then eventually she just went ahead and told her attorney about it anyway.
That attempt, successful or unsuccessful as it happened to be, is important if you're a prosecutor, because as our viewers know, if you've ever binge watched Law & Order, Jack McCoy loves to talk about something called consciousness of guilt. It's conduct that a defendant engages in that tells us that he or she knows they've done wrong. Fleeing, lying, covering up a crime. And in this situation, what Susan Wright did in the wake of this offense was textbook consciousness of guilt.
Jeffrey was nude. He had all of his clothes off. The evidence will show you that Susan Wright lit candles in the bedroom. This case is not about self-defense. This case is about selfishness.
Defense attorneys describe the night very differently.
He threw her down, grabbed her by the arms, and you'll see those bruises in the photos that the constable took in this case. He threw her to the ground, and he began punching her, and he kicked her with his bare feet.
The defense claims Jeffrey was high on cocaine that night and got angry when Susan suggested he needed help with his rage for allegedly abusing their 4-year-old son. The defense says that she wrestled the knife away from him when he threatened to kill her.
Let's go ahead and we'll talk about the infamous bed. That was probably the signature image of that entire trial.
It's the defining moment.
Yes. So prosecutor Kelly Siegler brings the couple's actual bed into the courtroom intact, places her co-counsel on the bed, straddles her co-counsel, and then proceeds to use a ruler to count out 193 stab wounds for the jury to see how long it took. That bed, by the way, is still in the Harris County archive. The frame of it is, anyway.
So one minor writer's embellishment. She actually straddled Paul Doyle, who was a fellow prosecutor. Maureen Newman was her co-counsel. Kelly needed somebody who was as big in size and stature as Jeff was. And that's how Paul ultimately achieved at least his 15 minutes of fame.
How much of an impact, though, do you think that had on the jury?
Oh, my goodness. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a video is worth 10,000. This was a case of recreating the second reel of Basic Instinct, because Kelly Siegler decided she could make up her own version, one that in my estimation wasn't tethered at all to reality.
Well, is it necessarily making up a version, or is it showing you the sheer ferocity it takes to stab another human being 193 times, the time it takes, the length it takes, the stamina it takes to do that?
I don't think there's any question about that. Look, and this is what I had to acknowledge, is that it was incredible courtroom theater. Again, the defining moment of this trial. Does that mean that then District Judge Jim Wallace should have permitted it? As I sit here today, all those many years later, no, I don't think so. I think that it was so inherently prejudicial. Look, our viewers are pretty sharp. They understand how the rules of evidence and procedure work. And it's not just that you want to recreate a crime. You've got to be able to do a couple of things. Number one, it's got to be relevant. It's got to bear at least some reality to what ultimately happened. But then, if the evidence itself is so unfairly prejudicial that its prejudicial effect is outweighed by whatever value it has, then in my estimation, it should have been kept out. It wasn't. I thought that we had at least a puncher's chance of succeeding on the first appeal. We didn't. I was crushed. And to this day, I still think that they were wrong as rain.
There was testimony that she somewhat, and I hate this term, but it's used so much, snapped. That she felt she was, yet you see, he was tied up. There are tie straps in the evidence photos. She used 2 different knives to complete the 193 stab wounds. She buried him. She cleaned up. She took the time to file a domestic dispute complaint against a person she knew was already dead. That doesn't sound like snapped. That sounds like thought out.
Well, I think we need to distinguish between the moment during which she engaged in the actual stabbing and then her conduct that follows in the wake of it. Because, as prosecutors love to tell juries, a defendant can form intent in an instant. Nobody questions that. I think the tough road to hoe that the defense had was, as you so aptly pointed out, being able to reconcile a battered woman who, as you said, snapped, with a woman who seemed to be cunning, contrived, and careful in the wake of the conduct that she engaged in.
It's unbelievable. I mean, how can a human being do what she did to my son?
An emotional Ron Wright Sr. takes the stand for the first time and tells the jury how difficult this trial has been for the Wright family, who watched as prosecutors reenacted how they say Susan stabbed her husband Jeffrey nearly 200 times.
Stab him in the eyeballs when he's awake. I can't believe she did. She's evil.
Susan is the sweetest, most tender-hearted person I've ever known.
Susan's mother, Sue Weish, paints a different picture of her daughter. Susan says she stabbed her husband in self-defense after years of abuse.
You would never, ever, ever have suspected that Susan could commit an act like this.
I think Susan, I've always believed that in a moment of madness, in a moment of what she believed was self-preservation, acted in the manner in which she did. Look, I think one of the narratives of this case that people will never be able to reconcile even after 2+ decades is what happened in that bedroom in West Houston that night. Was it a seduction? Was it a slaughter? Was it a woman doing what she could to save herself?
The prosecutor at the time, Kelly Siegler, said that's a flat-out lie.
It's a great soundbite, and it's a case that I think we could use as advocates, particularly as a prosecutor, of how to cross-examine a defendant. I remember I was a media participant observer for Channel 2 in the original trial, and I remember Kelly had a stack of index cards that she used to cross-examine Susan. Getting on the witness stand with a veteran prosecutor like Kelly Siegler with your life in the balance is going to cause most of us to lose it. And so in this case, defendants like Susan Wright, who are advancing a claim of self-defense, have got to get on the stand, because most of the time the jury needs to hear and wants to hear how and why they did what they did from a defendant's own lips.
7 men and 5 women didn't believe Susan Wright's defense of a battered wife who stabbed her husband 193 times and buried him in their backyard. The prosecution says Wright's biggest mistake was her 2 hours on the witness stand.
She's a liar, and it's not hard to catch a liar who's lying. You can't keep that up for 2 hours, especially when you tell as ridiculous a story as she did, locking herself into all those crazy details.
I personally did not find her credible. There was too many holes in her story.
For me, the biggest factor was the ligatures, how these ligatures affected whether he was tied down or not, and they were tied in a way that I couldn't overcome that.
Susan Wright came back into the courtroom to hear her fate. With her hand over her heart and a tug on her ear, she communicates with her family. A jury convicted Wright of murdering her husband, and after 5 hours of deciding her punishment, a jury sentenced her to prison.